It's great to see everyone. I'm Gabriel, speaking to you from Notre Dame. Thank you so much for joining our first IQSA Qur'an seminar. As I know many of you, it's good to see old friends, and it's also good to meet new friends over Zoom. And just personally, I'd like to begin by saying that our thoughts go out to all those who are suffering in this time, especially those who have contracted the virus, but also those who are suffering from any sort of isolation. As you know, the vision for these seminars is to connect scholars at a time of social distancing and to continue our academic conversations, which are part of the mission of the International Quranic Studies Association, which is sponsoring this seminar series. I'm really delighted to welcome Hythem Sidky, who will be offering our first talk. But before introducing him, I'd just like to offer a few reminders about how to make this all work well over Zoom. Hythem will speak for about 30 or 35 minutes. And during this time, it's important that everyone keep their microphones muted. We have a large group, which is great, which is wonderful. But if we have several people unmute their microphones, the background noise could be a distraction. But we will have time for discussion afterwards. So the vision for these seminars is not only to give a presentation, but also to have a forum for academic conversation. So we'll have about 20 to 25 minutes for conversation. When you do that, if you want to ask a question, simply open the participants tab, and there's an icon for that at the bottom of your screen. And then you can hit the raise hand button, which will be at the bottom of the participants tab. Of course, before speaking, you want to remember to unmute, and you can do that by hitting the icon in the bottom left of the main screen, or simply by holding down your space bar when you are speaking. And then after our conversation, we'll end promptly after 1 hour, so at noon, New York time, but we can keep the conversation going over Twitter or other social media using the hashtag IQSA Zoom. And as I mentioned on the website there, we will be posting the recording of this talk to the IQSA YouTube channel. So you'll be able to see this in all of the talks there. And kindly spread the news. Our vision for this series of seminars is to invite not only academics, but the general public, so all are welcome to join us. Okay, and now I have the pleasure of introducing Hythem. I'm grateful that he's offering our first talk in this series of Corona Qur'an seminars. I should be careful with the alliteration there to keep that straight. Dr. Hythem Sidky earned his PhD from the University of Notre Dame in 2018 and chemical and biomolecular engineering, and completed a postdoc at the University of Chicago in molecular engineering. As he puts it, he is a molecular engineer by day and a Qur'an scholar by night. Hythem published a review of Dan Brubaker's book, Corrections in Early Qur'an Manuscripts. I saw Dan is here with us in Al-Usur al-Wusta. And among his articles in preparation are on the regionality of Quranic codices. We'll be hearing something about that topic today. And consonantal dotting in the oral transmission of the Qur'an. And with Marijn van Putten, and I saw Marijn here also with us, pronominal system of Arabic in the Quranic reading traditions and early vocalized Quranic manuscripts. He has given talks at Leiden University, at the Collège de France, and in November 2019 at IQSA's most recent annual meeting. Today he will speak to us on Codex Damascensis and the evolution of the Syrian reading tradition. Welcome, Hythem.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Can you all hear me? All right, fantastic. Well, it's an honor to be here, and I'm very, very excited to share some research I've been working on a very interesting mushaf, a very interesting Quran codex. What my plan today is, as I go through my talk, because I think we have sort of a broader and less specialized audience, what I tried to do was every time I highlight an aspect of this manuscript of this Quran is to sort of give broader context by comparing it to other codices, other manuscripts, and also by just posing general, maybe I would call like unanswered questions in the field of early Quranic manuscripts. And so with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. And I have to give Zoom permissions here. Apologies. It appears that Zoom wants me to quit and rejoin before I can share my screen. So I will be back momentarily. I apologize. All right, I am back. Can everyone hear me? Okay, let's try this again. It says that the host has disabled attendee screen sharing. So Gabriel, if you can just...
I can take care of it.
Thank you. All right, let's try this again. There we go. And awesome. Okay, so I want to talk about Codex Damascensis and the evolution of the Syrian reading tradition. So the title or the name Codex Damascensis is a preliminary title. It would usually receive a number, but since there are a number of manuscripts that come from the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, hence the name Codex Damascensis, and they haven't been sorted through, there's no number assigned to it yet. So I just kind of left it blank like that. So the first thing I want to do is kind of highlight the physical attributes and aspects of this manuscript. I've been working on this manuscript for a while, actually, a couple years now. There are 4 folios held in Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, under Arab 6140A. 4 folios are there. There are 2 additional folios in Cambridge University Library under the MS-ADD 1125 shelf mark. Now, there are actually 30 or so more folios in the Turkish Museum, or the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Arts, also known as TM. I have an alert here. Okay. Now, the folios in TM have not been fully cataloged, so we're not really quite sure how many there are right now. To a number of them, and we'll be taking a look at them in a little bit. Now, like most, if not all, early Hijazi manuscripts, it's in a vertical format, so you can see it here on the left-hand side. And according to François de Roche, this is in the Hijazi 1 script. So this is one of the oldest paleographic script styles of Qur'anic manuscripts. This specific manuscript is undated. By that I mean there is no colophon, there's no waqf that survives, and no radiocarbon dating has been done on this manuscript. In fact, it's particularly challenging for this mushaf because the writing usually extends to the very edges. There aren't very large margins, so a curator would frown upon taking a portion of this manuscript for radiocarbon dating. But I hope one day it will get radiocarbon dated. There are between 22 to 25 lines per page, give or take. And what's very nice about this manuscript is that it has many different layers. And what do I mean by that? I mean that this manuscript was originally written, so you can see the original consonantal text, but then the manuscript was vocalized. So there are these red dots, which we'll take a look at a little bit later. And then there are verse separators, like this little red ha that we see right here on these dashes. And actually through investigation, you can find that all of these different layers didn't happen at the same time. They took place over time. And what that allows us to do is study each layer independently and look at how this manuscript evolved over time. Can we, based on looking at the different layers, can we say something about where the manuscript was held, where it might have been transported to back and forth, etc. So the beauty of this is it's very layered, and it gives us a good picture into the tradition it represents. Now, between the folios that are in Paris and in Cambridge, those hold about 4.5% of the entire Quran. Altogether, with the folios from Turkey, it's about a quarter of the Quran. So it's a substantial percentage of the entire text of the Quran. So it's a very interesting manuscript. All right. So some aspects of the Mus'haf include verse separators. So again, I talked about this layered history. So the first layer, as far as verse separators are concerned, are these sort of strokes, these sort of diagonal oblique strokes that are usually about 5 or so stacked on top of each other that separate each verse. And then someone later on came along and in certain places erased these original verse separators and added 5 mark and a 10 mark. So the 5 mark here, this is a ha, it's represented by the Arabic letter ha, and this is part of the Hisab al-Jummal, the Arabic numeral system, where the ha represents 5. And at a 10 verse mark, what they did is they put a red circle and they surrounded it with a series of dots, a series of decorative dots. So this marks every 5th verse, and every 10th verse is marked with this symbol right here. Now, one interesting thing, aspect of the script grammar, as Thomas Milo calls it, of this Mus'haf, is actually the ya, so the word final ya here. And so one interesting question is, what governs a scribe's decision to either write a normal ya like this, facing forward, or a retroflex, a returning ya like this? And so what I'm about to present here doesn't necessarily hold for every manuscript, but it does for this one, where the default is a retroflex ya, so returning ya like this, except if the preceding letter is a waw or any letter that descends below the baseline, which I'm generalizing. I've only seen it with waw. And so it shows that the scribe had a sort of geometric considerations. They didn't want to draw the ya returning such that it didn't intersect with the waw, or at least perhaps considered it to be displeasing visually. So this is an interesting insight into this aspect of the script grammar of this particular manuscript. Now, one thing I think I like to compare this Mus'haf with, this manuscript with, so on the left-hand side here, I have a folio from TM, from Turkey. And this one preserves a surah separator. So this preserves a transition, a surah transition. And I'm comparing it here to the very famous Birmingham manuscript. And so you can see sort of visually, they're both Hijazi script. And they both have this very distinct Umayyad noon. So the noon here, the final noon, kind of has this very sharp, almost L-shaped right here. And you can see it here as well. It's very distinct. The same kind of medial ha and many other similarities. Both manuscripts are about the same size. And what's interesting, of course, is the Birmingham manuscript has been radiocarbon dated. There was only one test done on a single folio. So I would take this with a grain of salt, but it dated to basically the first half of the 7th century. Now, what's interesting here is that in all the folios that I have seen for this Mus'haf, which preserves a surah transition, it has been erased and written over by a later hand in this more new style script. Fatihat Surat Luqman, this is the opening of the chapter of Luqman, and then it lists the number of verses in the surah. But actually, if you zoom in a little bit, you can actually see remnants of what was originally there, sort of these dark lines, a few dots here. And it's very reminiscent of the sort of very primitive geometric artwork that you find in this manuscript as well, in the Birmingham manuscript, and a few other early Hijazi manuscripts as well. And so the reason I'm pointing out all these things is, by all indications, this is just as old paleographically, maybe even certain codicological aspects as well. Orthography is very old. We'll talk about that in a little bit. As the Birmingham manuscript, it just hasn't been radiocarbon dated. So I'm just kind of trying to give you some perspective on the age of this manuscript. Now, as far as orthography is concerned, it bears all the usual hallmarks of an old Qur'anic manuscript. For example, words like bi'ayatina, with our signs or with our signs, has an additional denticle, an additional ya here. Unlike the Cairo edition, which predominantly uses the spelling bi'ayatina with a single ya. So, some have hypothesized that this might represent the loss of Hamza. So this would be biayatina as opposed to biayatina. So the glottal stop is not articulated. And so this is present throughout this manuscript. Shay, so words like shay have an additional alif. It's very hard to say with these kinds of features whether they are absolute markers of archaicness or of age. So if, for example, I find that this manuscript has the spelling of shay with an added alif, is that necessarily older than one that doesn't? We can't be so definitive about it, but I'm pointing out these broad orthographic features that all characterize an archaic manuscript. Ba'is here has an additional alif as well. And something interesting is words that are these words like da'b, or nas or qala are usually, other than qala actually, are usually spelled plain A, so they have an alif. In this manuscript, though, the word da'b, da'aba, is missing an alif, is spelled defectively, so kada'b right here, and that's quite unusual to find. And so Marijn van Putten, in a very nice paper, it highlights the fact that spelling this word without an alif necessarily means that this word, whoever wrote this, was trying to represent kadab without a hamza, as opposed to kadab with a glottal stop here, with a hamza. So we find that as well. Qala, very interestingly, this manuscript, every instance of qala that I saw was spelled defectively, so without an alif, qaf lam, except for a couple instances that I've highlighted right here. So only 2 of them they chose to write as waqala here and qala right here. And so that brings up the question, and this is one of the open questions in the field, I would say, is what is the nature, what is the meaning behind the choice to write qala defective or to write it plain A with an alif? What does this mean? Is it part of a scribal tradition? Is it where certain regions or certain scribal schools decided to write certain qala with alif and certain other ones without an alif? Nobody has studied manuscripts, enough manuscripts systematically to answer this question. So it is an open question. And it's a very interesting one because it can tell us something about the transmission history of these manuscripts beyond very coarse features like regionality, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We can see there's a scribal correction here. This is قال ابن he said, "Oh, son of my mother." And again, this is a facet of early manuscripts where it wrote it alif ba waw, so ibn without the hamza. And here's someone you can see. In fact, it's hard to say that this was much later. It has that very distinct noon, but maybe this tail of the alif might give away its age. But it looks like this adjustment was made pretty early on in the life of this manuscript as well. So again, different orthographic features highlighting the age of this manuscript. Okay, so now this brings us to scribal errors, and I put errors in quotes here because some of them do appear to be errors, and some of them were actually corrected by the original scribe, and we can tell this by the ink. So for example, fahuwa was left out right here, and it was added in by, almost certainly the original scribe who left it out. There's a waw here as well. But there are some later corrections, like an alif right here that was definitely added later because you can see it's even vocalized. And things like that. And so there are dozens of these sorts of errors and corrections throughout this manuscript. And what I want to do is zoom in and highlight a few interesting ones that stood out to me. Of course, also the study of these corrections and these scribal errors is very important to understand the evolution of certain variants in orthography, like the one I showed before, abna and also what we would consider to be non-canonical orthographic variants. Those are very interesting as well. And so with that, what I wanted to do is talk in a little more detail about some of the interesting non-Uthmanic, I will call them, variants that I found in this manuscript. So in Q7, verse 142, there's the verse وَأَتْمَمْنَاهَا. Okay, وَأَتْمَمْنَاهَا is the standard Uthmanic reading. This is the canonical text. And here we have وَتَمَّمْنَاهَا and a later alif that was added. And this is just an emphatic change in morphology here. But what's interesting is one might say, well, how do we know that the scribe didn't just forget the alif? So the scribe meant to write وَتَمَّمْنَاهَا, or وَأَتْمَمْنَاهَا, pardon, and they just forgot to write the alif. Lucky for us, we can see that the scribe actually initially wrote an alif. So you can see the remnant of the alif, and then they scraped it away, and then they wrote تَمَّمْنَاهَا. And someone later on added the alif in here. And so what that tells me, at least, is that the scribe was copying from an exemplar that had an alif in it, but consciously decided to erase it and go with a non-standard reading وَتَمَّمْنَاهَا. Now, if you go through the traditional literature, you'll find that this variant is attributed to Ubay ibn Ka'b. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But then a couple verses later, we have بِأَحْسَنِهَا in the feminine right here. And we can see here this ha and alif was added in later. And we can see the outline of an original ha that was here. So what was written was بِأَحْسَنِهِ in the masculine. Now, if you go through the traditional literature, you find this variant mentioned that it was read وَقُرِئَ بِأَحْسَنِهِ, or in this manuscript it would be بِأَحْسَنِهُ بِغَيْرِ أَلِفٍ عَلَى التَّذْكِيرِ in the masculine. But there was no reference to who read this, so it was not attributed to anyone. Interestingly, again, one verse later, we have this word يَتَّخِذُوهُ, which was originally written as يَتَّخِذُوهَا. We can see in the feminine, we can see the remnant of the alif, and the shape, the letter shape of this ha is not of a word final detached ha right here. This is an initial ha right there. Interestingly enough, this variant is also attributed to Ubay ibn Ka'b. Now, this brings up a broader question, which is the question of companion readings. Are these readings really the readings of companions, or are they back projections onto famous companions who did have dissenting readings compared to the canonized Uthmanic, what we call the Uthmanic standard Mus'haf? Ultimately, without a more exhaustive study, it's impossible to say. But what I will say is, in this case, what we find is a uniformity of attribution to Ubay, a very small sample size. But the other interesting thing we'll see is that this Mus'haf does have a Syrian provenance. Not only was it found in a Syrian deposit, but there are other Syrian elements of this Mus'haf. And Ubay's reading was recorded to have been popular in the Syrian region before the proliferation of the standardized Uthmanic recension. And so I just find that curious. I think the jury's still out. A lot of research has to be done on this, but I just point this out because it's very interesting. Now, as far as I'm aware, no one has systematically collected from the earliest manuscripts. I have a running list going, actually, of companion readings that are found, or so-called companion readings that are found in the earliest Qur'anic manuscripts, and they do die out over time. So they do fall out of favor as the Uthmanic manuscript or the Uthmanic standard edition becomes more and more prevalent. But interestingly, another manuscript that I'm currently studying and working on an edition of is Arab 331. This is a bit later, late 1st century, early 2nd century manuscript. Beautiful Kufic B1A manuscript. And here you can see in Surah Al-Baqarah Q2, فَإِنْ آمَنُوا بِمَا آمَنْتُمْ بِهِ. So the standard reading has بِمِثْل, and in fact here it's not even vocalized as بِمِثْل, but you can clearly see someone came in later on and added the بِمِثْل in here, or بِمَثَلِ. And if you go through the literature, you find many reports, actually not one, but in many of the earliest books, Abu Ubaid, I'm not sure about Al-Farra, but very early, at least late 2nd century attributions of this reading to Ibn Abbas, where it is said that Ibn Abbas disapproved of the Uthmanic reading of if they believe in what is like what you have believed in, بِمِثْلِ مَا آمَنْتُمْ بِهِ. And he said that لا تقرأ, or do not read, بِمِثْلِ مَا آمَنْتُمْ بِهِ, like that which you have believed in, because God has no mathil, there is nothing like God, but rather you should read فَإِنْ آمَنُوا بِمَا آمَنْتُمْ بِهِ. So if they believe in what you believed in. Now this particular variant, very clearly this was intended by the scribe of this manuscript. It's also purported to have been read by Anas ibn Malik, the famous companion, and also Ibn Mas'ud. Again, I just want to highlight this to the general audience here to just present to them that this is an open question right now, and a very fascinating area of study. And the closest thing I've seen to this was Yassine Dutton has a paper that came out in 2017 that was titled "When Do the Shawadh Become Shadh?" Something like that. He doesn't quite look at companion readings, but he entertains the question of the fact of the matter is the earlier the manuscript, the more we find these sort of little remnants of non-Uthmanic variants in them, and they slowly die out. And so when were these variants considered to really be non-canonical and unacceptable to have in manuscripts? Again, it's an open question. So again, talking about provenance, let's the next layer would be, let's look at the verse separators. So here, what I've done is I've picked out all the verses that occur in the folios that I have studied where there is a disagreement either between this manuscript and among the different traditional attributions, verse count attributions, pardon me. So here I use the same sort of illumination to indicate a regular verse mark, and I use this circle with a bunch of smaller ones around it to denote a 10 verse separator. So this mushaf is right here, and you can see that this one has a 10th verse marker right here, which agrees with everything but Kufa. And then ala bani Israel, this verse does not have a separator, and so it only agrees with Basra, Damascus, and Hems at this point. And so we can go through this exercise and list out all of them. We have a 5th one. And we can see here that the 5 verse separator only agrees with the 2 Syrian traditions. But then incorporating these last 2 verses, it becomes very clear that the Mus'haf here agrees with the Himsi to the exclusion of Damascus, and where Damascus has a verse separator, this Mus'haf does not. And so we can conclude from this that the manuscript appears to follow the Himsi verse counting tradition. Now, looking more into this, I actually find something very interesting. There was one verse separator here that was added. You can see it's in a black ink, or actually 2 of them that were added here in black ink that were later. They're crammed in. They don't fit in here nicely. And they don't actually work out with the counts, the circles that I mentioned, that were added in by presumably the same person. And what's interesting, and this brings up something which I think has not yet been discussed in the literature or in Western literature at all, and what I think has been misunderstood in also the Arabic literature. And this is a concept what I have tentatively titled the pseudo verse separator. It looks like a verse separator because it's a series of dashes or the same symbol that's used to mark a verse separator, but it wasn't counted as a verse separator. And how do we know this? We know this because it isn't included in the tally. So when we see a 10th verse separator and we count how many individual ones are in the middle, we find there might be 11 or 12. Now, we could say that the person couldn't do math. It's possible. Maybe they made a mistake. But when you see this repeating pattern over and over again, it must point to something more. And if you go back to the literature and dig through the books, you find that early Muslim scholars mention this concept of what they called ما يشبه الفاصلة ولا يعد, what looks like, what is similar to a verse separator, but is not counted. And so I believe that this might basically be a reference to these pseudo verse separators. And they would be the equivalent of the modern day pausal sign. Like if you open a modern day Cairo edition or a Mus'haf, you'll find the Jim, a Qaf, a Sad, which represent basically sentence breaks, natural places where you can pause. And because these symbols had not yet been invented or developed, they just used the same symbol that they did to mark verse separators, but they didn't count them. Now, looking at the variants in this manuscript, the orthographic variants, this really clued me into something very interesting. So here in Surah Al-Anfal, Q8, verse 67, we have مَا كَانَ لِلنَّبِي. So with a definite article, it is not becoming of the prophet. Compared to the standard reading of مَا كَانَ لِنَبِي, it's not becoming of a prophet. And this is found in this manuscript, Codex Damascensis. It's also found in the British Library, famous British Library Mus'haf, which has been studied by Yassine Dutton and Intisar Rab, who both show that this manuscript is Syrian, and Intisar in particular shows it is Himsi in provenance. And if we go through the literature, we find an interesting reference by one Abu Hythem Sidky, mid-3rd century scholar of readings and Qur'anic rasm. And he says that in the Mus'haf of Hims, so very interesting, in the Mus'haf of Hims, the one that Uthman sent to Syria, we find in Al-Anfal, Ma kana lin nabi with 2 lambs. So he mentions this variant and attributes it to Hims. And he says that this Mus'haf was sent by Uthman to Hims. Now, I show in other work through a series of including orthographic variants, but other evidences, that it does seem very likely that this is a historical detail that was lost to time, because nobody else mentions this. That in fact, it seems likely that when the Quran was standardized, when the, let's call the Uthmanic standardization project took place, the Syrian Mus'haf was sent to Hims as opposed to Damascus, which sort of would be what one would intuitively think because of the prominence of the Umayyad dynasty and the significance of Damascus to the later Muslim empire. Okay, so vocalization, a lot can be said. I am running out of time, I can see that. So what I'll say is there are many features like sulat mim, so the pronominal suffix here has vowel lengthening. This is typically a feature of Hijazi readers among the canonical readers. So instead of minkum, they would say minkumu. What's interesting is the singular pronominal suffix is actually unharmonized. So this is alayhu instead of alayhi, and this is not featured in any canonical reading. What's also interesting is every single singular pronominal suffix, masculine at least, is unharmonized except for the word bihi, which is harmonized. So it's bihi, but alayhu, ilayhu, ladayhu, etc. Very interesting. I don't have much else to say about this other than I'm working on a study of this with Marijn van Putten. So if you're interested in it, stay tuned for that work. It has hollow root imala. So this is a feature of some Kufans and of Ibn Dhakwan, who is a transmitter of the Syrian reader, Ibn Amr. So ja'akum instead of ja'akum. Daqat instead of daqat. This manuscript does feature hems. So mu'minun instead of mu'minun. Sayyi'atikum, etc. So it has features like that. Just make sure I'm not getting called out here. All right. Now, we can skip over that. Now, one interesting thing that we can do is also go through every single word in this manuscript and collect the farsh. So these are the individual variants of the words that we find in the manuscript. And this applies to everything. So ba'isin versus bay'as, mithaqa, all kinds of things, every single variation in the words in this manuscript. And we can compare these variants to the different canonical readers. And what we find is we don't see that anyone really sticks out. We can see that this manuscript agrees mostly with Asim 22 times, but also with Hamza 22 times, and then 21 times with Ibn Amr and 21 times with Kisa'i, Yaqub. It's a mix. Nothing really stands out. And so this is where I want to move to a technique. It's a numerical analysis technique called diffusion maps. I can't hope to explain this to you in this short amount of time, but it's basically a mathematical technique which allows us to take all of the information on farsh and usul, all of the reading variants in this manuscript, digest them, and spit out a portrait that represents these variations. And so when we do that, and this is going beyond farsh because this incorporates usul, it incorporates rules, and it incorporates specific variants. We can see here the star represents, I called it majhul, unknown, this unknown reading, and it lives up here. And what we can see is we have the Ibn Kathir, the Meccan, and Nafi', Medinan here, Abu Ja'far, the Medinan here, and we have the Basrans here and the Kufans here, generally speaking. And this hints at some regionality. We have the Iraqis, the people from Iraq, the Eastern readers out here, and they're separated pretty well based on Basra, Kufa. And we have the Hijazis here, and we have this unknown manuscript, which perhaps might be Syrian up here. There is one exception to this, which is Ibn Amr, who's supposed to be a Syrian reader, and he's sitting all the way here in where we would expect to have a Iraqi reading. And so this tells us something about his reading. Now, if we superimpose this on a map, funny enough, we find that this lines up with the general geography of the Middle East here, where we have the Iraqis living in Iraq, the Hijazis, generally speaking, spanning the Hijaz, and this unknown manuscript all the way up here in Syria, where we might expect it. The only exception, as I mentioned, is Ibn Amir. And so what we can do is we can say, well, maybe Ibn Amir's reading evolved. What if we try to take certain features, put them back into his reading, and see where he ends up? And so it turns out, if we take sila, which is the lengthening of the pronominal suffix, and put it back in his reading, he ends up in Syria, where we would expect him. And so what this indicates is perhaps his reading went through a process of classicization, an evolution of his reading over time, such that it matched more what we would expect from the Iraqi readers out here on the right. Another interesting consequence, and I'll finish with this, is that we see regionality in the readings. And this is important because other early studies that were done on a limited selection of words sampled from the Quran, like Christopher Melchert's work, couldn't really tease out any strong indication of regionality. But this more holistic analysis shows us that indeed there really does appear to be regionality in the readings. And this does reflect, at least in what I would say is a hint of, or a strong indication rather, not a hint, of authentic transmission from those readers as their readings became documented in the books in the subsequent centuries. And so I think with that, I'd like to end here and thank you all for your attention. Again, I want to highlight that there are actually numerous early Quranic manuscripts like the Codex Petrosino-Petropolitanos, the British Library Mushaf, this Mushaf that I'm looking at here, the Birmingham manuscript, that are all Syrian. And they all come from Fustat and from Damascus. The ones that I mentioned, at least, if you're interested in listening to more about that, I'm happy to share. There are elements of companion readings that do linger on after the Uthmanic standardization. And I want to mention that really we should move beyond simply looking at Farsh if you want to fully understand the regionality of the reading traditions. And so with that, I will take questions. And go ahead, sorry.
No, just thank you. Did you have a final thought? Did you want to add something?
No, I think I'm already a little over time, so I think we'll move to questions, and then I can answer anything anyone might have.
That was really excellent. Thank you so much, Hythem. One of the disadvantages of being on Zoom is that you cannot hear our approbation, the thunderous applause that you would have heard if we were at an IQSA meeting. But we do have these little icons we can add to give you some virtual applause.
Thank you.
Hey, Hythem, if it's okay, I will manage questions. Is that all right?
Absolutely. Do you want to read them out to me so I can then close this window?
No, I think we'll just have people unmute and speak. So again, friends, if you'd like to ask a question, if you can go click on participants, and then you're going to see a little icon there with a hand in the bottom left. So just click that, and I will recognize it on the participant screen. And when I call you out, just remember to unmute either by holding down the space bar or clicking the mute and unmute button on the lower left side of your screen. Okay, Abdul Karim, please.
Hello, am I heard?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm an archaeology student from King Saud University, and I was actually wondering, in relation to ancient Semitic languages, could this possibly be a reflection of the consideration of local languages in terms of the vowels that are stressed or expressed?
Yeah, so certainly I don't think I would be the best person to answer that question. I'm not a linguist, but what I will say is definitely certain aspects of the reading traditions, whether it's imala or hems or even the pronominal suffixes, all these aspects are representative of different, I want to use the word dialect here, but maybe just use linguistic practice, different linguistic practices that vary from region to region. Now, when it comes to the reading traditions themselves, they're artificial. So they mix together different linguistic features that would not be found in a single natural dialect. And so we have to sort of distinguish between sort of the art form, that is the qira'at, the reading traditions, and what would be more natural language representing these different phonological and phonetic variants.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Raghayeb. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing. Do you hear me? Be sure to unmute.
So there, it seems like in the chat, they're mentioning some stuff.
Okay. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go for it.
Okay. Why this manuscripts aren't undated? Is my question.
Oh, why is it undated? Well, that's a good question. So oftentimes we find manuscript datings like a colophon or a waqf in the beginning or an end of a manuscript. So what happens with these codices is the first pages to wear out and to sort of be lost, if you will, are usually the exterior pages. So the inside of a manuscript of a codex is most protected, and the outer leaves are the ones that are lost. So if there were to have been a waqf or any sort of date, that likely would have been at the beginning or the end, those are lost for our earliest manuscripts. So that's why I say it's undated. Now, fortunately for us, we do have a technique, radiocarbon dating, to allow us to estimate the likelihood of an age of a manuscript, but this specific one has not been radiocarbon dated yet.
Is that okay? Do you have a follow-up there, Raghayeb?
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. I hope dated in the future.
Yes, me as well.
Indeed. Okay, we have a couple more questions. Dan, be sure to unmute there.
It's me, Dan Brubaker, right?
Yeah.
It's just a small question. Hythem, great presentation. Thank you so much. Really interesting. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. On the ya, the retroflex versus forward facing. So I just want to clarify. So you looked and you only saw that facing forward when there was a vowel before it. You
Correct.
can that's in other words between an open syllable versus a closed syllable in this case.
It's not necessarily syllabic. I think it's geometric. I think it's a geometric consideration.
I just wanted to clarify that because it's interesting. Right.
Now, I don't think this whole, I know for certain this is not the case in other manuscripts, but it's an observation that holds true here. So it just allows us to like consider this when looking at other manuscripts, the geometric aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Okay, thanks.
No problem.
Great. Imar.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Marko Chkali. I'm a doctor at the University of Tartu in Estonia. I had a question concerning the plana and non-plana spelling of the aleph with regards to qala. Do you have any ideas about this? Could you maybe explain a bit more if you have any considerations maybe to, I don't know, distinguish between, say, the imperative qul and the past tense qala?
That's a very good question. I don't have maybe a satisfying answer because I think this question is still up for discussion. I'll mention a few things. The first thing is what we see over time as a very broad sort of principle is the slow evolution from defective to plain when it comes to qala and in general alif. So that's a general trend we observe. But even in the oldest manuscripts, I don't know of any single manuscript that exclusively has qul, qaf, lam. So there's always one or two, like a few instances that you find that are actually plain. So it brings up the question, why or why? And so some of the other ones that are spelled qaf, lam, you can say with almost near certainty that in certain contexts, it wouldn't work as qul. It has to have been qala. So then it brings up the question, why these? And it might be, so one, this is just like a hand-waving answer. It might be a scribal tradition. So what if we start lining up all of these early manuscripts and looking at them and seeing if there's a pattern? Maybe, you know, all these manuscripts over here spell all the defective one, the same qalas defectively and the same ones plain. And then that might tell us about scribal traditions and scribal schools. We just don't know yet. Now, there are a subset of these qala and qul that end up becoming regionalized. And so we see those pop up even in some early manuscripts and become, they sort of evolve into plain very rapidly, and they remain frozen like that, compared to all other ones. So there are ones that do, that we know are part of a regional tradition. And I discussed this in a paper right now I have under review that's on, it looks at the regional traditions in Quranic codices. So that might give you a little bit of an answer to your question.
Thank you. Great. Okay, Abdel Fadi.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Reynolds, and thank you, Hythem. I have just a question. It seems to me that if I understood correctly from the presentation, that the efforts to modify or correct these variations is to bring it in line with the Uthmanic Rasm. Is that a fair assessment?
Yep, that's correct.
So this indicates at least that it could have been prior to the Uthmanic tradition, or maybe some readings that still made their way after that tradition was put in place?
Yes, so that's a very good question. So there's a little bit of nuance we have to unpack here. This manuscript is most definitely part of the Uthmanic text type. We know this, for example, by looking at orthographic idiosyncrasies, like the work published by Dr. Van Putten. And if you look at rahmatallah, ni'matallah, shurakaihim, words like that, you can find that falls in line with the Uthmanic text type. So it is a sort of a child, a descendant of that text type, but what it does contain is it does contain non-Uthmanic variants. Some that I would say are not like a scribal error, but as I showed you one of them, you can see that an alif was written, it was deliberately erased, and then it was written over by the same scribe who copied this mushaf down. And so what that indicates is that there seemed to have been, especially in the early period, some amount of non-Uthmanic readings that were still acceptable by some, and they incorporated them into their manuscripts despite the standardization, despite the Uthmanic standard, and over time those died out. And of course, we can't tell when they were corrected, but when someone later on came along, they wanted to bring this manuscript in line with the standard text and oftentimes corrected those. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, shukran, Hythem.
Yep, you're welcome.
Hythem, if it's okay, I'd like to interject a question of my own. I see Rami has a question, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I think maybe I'm not the only one who's wondering about the geographical correspondence between what I understood was a statistical projection and then its projection onto the map. This is pure coincidence and just sort of a cool thing.
So that's a good question. I didn't have time to get into that. I had to rush it a little bit, but I don't think it's a coincidence. I think the very fact that you get something that looks like this, where you have the geography reflected in the projection. I didn't put any geographic information in this. To me, indicates that the reading traditions, as artificial as they are, they still capture elements of local in linguistic practices. And so you imagine now I don't want to overstep and say something that is linguistically incorrect, but I just want to leave it at the fact that, to me, this is a strong indication, and I've discussed it with a couple of my linguist colleagues, and I think they more or less agree with me that this is a strong indication of true regionality in these readings. So Nafi', in fact, there's a paper, I think on academia, there's a draft of a paper on academia by, his name escapes me, Suhail Lahir, and he looks at he calls it phonological flux, and he looks only at Nafi' and Asim, but he also sees this element of regionality. So things where grammarians ascribed linguistic features to Hijaz, to Tamim, to the Eastern Arab dialects or linguistic practices in the Western, we see come out here. So despite all of the artificiality, the readings do have some element of natural dialect or linguistic practice baked into them. I think that's clear from this analysis.
And maybe I'm belaboring the point, but if I could just quickly follow up. So you see statistical variations, which can be charted out. But how would they correspond to geographical regions? Because I believe the projection is precisely, the icons there is precisely just mapped onto a geographical grid, right? So does that make sense? Is that lucid?
Yes. Okay. So all I did was, this is what the map looks like. I just put it on a map. I just like put a map behind it.
Right, right.
So, yes, exactly. So how do I explain this? Okay, so an analogy, let me give an analogy with weather patterns. Okay, so, you know, I'm living in a near the Washington, D.C. area right now. So you imagine that the weather where I am right now would be fairly correlated with the weather in Northern Virginia, for example, because we're close. Now, the temperature won't be exactly the same. I might have a little bit of rain here, but not as much rain over there. But in general, the weather in our area is going to be closer together than, say, the weather out in California. I think that's intuitive to everybody. And if it turns out, if you take weather data, like weather data, and say nothing about geography and run through the same process of projection, you would also recover a geographic map. And the reason behind that is that the something about geography gets encoded, gets baked into the measurements, that the observations that we're making. So the observations here are the variance in the reading traditions. And the geographic element would be, well, if two people or two peoples live close together, they have contact, then one would presume or expect perhaps that their language or linguistic practices might be closer than someone living far away. And so based on those correlations, that's how I imagine geography would emerge in a picture like this. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Excellent, absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for your patience, Rami. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Rami Halase, and thank you, Hythem. That's a wonderful presentation. Now, my question is on the words of hatta and ala. Have you looked into how they are spelled in the manuscript, and if they are the maqsura, alif maqsura or alif mamdude? And the second question, and this is a three-part question, sorry for that, but the second question would be, do you think there are any, the way that they are written, they can indicate any kind of a geographical origin of the manuscript, scribal preference, or just merely to the development of the Arabic language? And the third part, do you have an idea when that transition started to be more consistent in the manuscript?
That's an excellent question. So the answer is yes and yes. So ala, so just for the general audience, we can find ala and hatta spelled either with a ya, so an alif maqsura, or spelled with a normal alif. Now the alif maqsura spelling is the predominant spelling, but we do see the alif spelling pop up. Now, what's interesting is what we find, the alif spelling is found most often in the Kufic C1, or the Kufic C, generally speaking, text script style. And one interesting thing that I found in my study of regionality is that this same text type, and actually it's in the Sanat palimpsest as well, we find this alif spelling as well. Now, which is not a C1 script style, it's actually a more Hijazi, if anything, Kufi B tendencies in it. And what I found is that manuscripts that have this feature of ala with an alif and hatta with an alif, they are, I think, almost all of them Medinan in their regional variants. So it indicates to me that it might have some Hijazi prominence to it, or at least Medinan quality to it. So that speaks to your question about, can it say something about the regionality? Interestingly enough, it does pop up in some inscriptions as well, non-Quranic, just, you know, graffiti and prayers and invocations with an alif every now and then. And as you know, all that stuff is sort of emerging from the general area of Medina and the surroundings, at least the ones that I have seen with that. So absolutely, it is an indicator, as far as I have seen, of regionality. It seems to point to the Hijaz, and maybe more specifically the Medinan text type. As for your other question about the age, it does die out. It falls out of practice. Off the top of my head, I can't give you a date, maybe 3rd century, something like that, but I have seen it pop up in Maghribi new style Qur'ans every now and then. I remember being challenged to find a later manuscript that had it, and you do see it, but it does fall out of practice in general, and you find the alif maqsura or the ya spelling, which is the normal spelling, sort of take over.
Thank you, Hythem. We have maybe 2 more questions. It's 11:56, so I'll just ask the first one, which is in the chat box there, and then Matthew has a question, and that will be it. So Abdul Karim asks a follow-up. Is it possible that the dialects, it's a big one, maybe this is unfair to ask for a short answer. Are the dialects the remnants of the original ahruf?
Oh, my personal opinion is no. And I would say that this was an opinion of relatively early, maybe not terribly early, people like Abu Ubaid. So he dies in 224 AH. Now, as far as I'm aware, he's the earliest authority that I have found who actually claimed that the ahruf, the 7 ahruf, whatever that may be, are actually 7 dialects or dialects of the Arabic language. I do have a paper on this that I'm working on with my colleague Ramon Harvey, which looks at the early Muslim reception of the concept of the Sabat Ahruf and the evolution of their understanding of the 7 Ahruf or Sabat Ahruf. So I would say just wait for that. Hopefully it'll answer your question in more detail.
Great. And then very quickly, Matthew.
Hi. Thank you, Dr. Sidky, for this amazing presentation. Very helpful. So I'm a non-expert, and I have a non-expert question that's pretty simple, I think. And you began to already kind of answer it, but I'm wondering these Mushaf variations that are kind of regionally distributed. Those were still. It seems like the impression that I'm getting from what you're saying is that they were relatively in active use, they hadn't all died out or fallen out of use by the time that attributions to different regional ahruf began, right? These were still being read in the 2nd, 3rd century, right? In general, would you say?
Yeah, so let's sort of distinguish between the reading traditions, the qira'at, and the ahruf. So the ahruf is sort of a nebulous concept that is found in many prophetic hadiths that no one really knows what it means. But we can speak of sort of things that we know, and we know that the qira'at emerge as a decidedly post-Uthmanic phenomenon. And so these are simply the codification of different constructs or constructions of readings, of just choices of words and linguistic practices and things like that by individuals who attained fame in different parts of the Muslim world. Now, these figures, they lived primarily in the mid-2nd century. They were codified by Ibn Mujahid, who dies 324, so in the early 4th century. But they were documented. You can find references to them all the way back to Sibawayh has 1 or 2 references to readings. Al-Farra has many references in his books. So we do have documentation in writing of these readings, just not in the same level of detail as Ibn Mujahid very early on. And they were alive, they were practiced and transmitted, some more than the others. So the reading of Nafi', for example, is the most well-attested reading of all the reading traditions. It spread very rapidly all across North Africa, all the way out to Muslim Spain. Very early on, it was documented very well. Another reading, like the reading of Ibn Amir or Ibn Kathir, are transmitted through singular chains multiple times before they reach 1 or 2 people. So they're not very well attested, they're not very well documented. But they were, as far as we can say, sort of a very, maybe in a cautious way, they were living, in that they were being used to some extent, not necessarily retained as the original figure in the 2nd century would have read it. That answer is still an open question. But I do recommend you read Shadi Nasr's book on the transmission of the reading traditions. It's an excellent book and primer into this subject.
I'll do that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Terrific. Well, before we thank Hythem officially or in any way we can through Zoom, I just briefly wanted to add a few notes. First of all, that we will be doing this every week for the next probably 5 weeks, so please join us. So that's the good news. The bad news is that next week I'll be presenting myself on a question of sin in the Quran. But then there's more good news following that, because just today I heard from Professor Johanna Pink, who's here with us, that she will be presenting 2 weeks from now. So please tune in every week. As I mentioned at the opening, the recording of these talks will be available on IQSA's YouTube channel. And so feel free to spread the news about that and to distribute far and wide. And of course, we can keep the conversation going with the hashtag IQSAZoom. Feel free to connect with me on Twitter. Hythem and many others are also on Twitter, or you might do that on other social media platforms. So finally, you may know, friends, a couple of people have shown that there's this little icon on the bottom of the screen, reactions on Zoom or whatever language you read it in. So you can add a thumbs up or an applause. That was really great. Hythem puts the pressure on me next week, but I'm very grateful for that wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone.
Mm-hmm.